This week on Brian Ross Investigates, it was one of the ugliest days in American history, immortalized by Hollywood in the movie Selma.
See, she parts in the middle, and then...
4 schoolgirls killed by a Ku Klux Klan bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. It took decades to get full justice for those responsible, and only because prosecutor and future Senator Doug Jones would not let the case drop. Now Jones joins us to talk about another pivotal court case sure to make history, the trial of police officer Derek Chauvin. Plus vaccine phobia. Has the Biden administration made too much of the issues with Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, or not enough?
All 50 states have now paused Johnson & Johnson shots as regulators meet today to investigate those 6 cases of rare but potentially fatal blood clots.
And how long will we need to still wear masks outdoors when the risk is so low? We're joined by Dr. Boris Lushniak, the former acting Surgeon General. And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
But Ted Cruz needs to look in the mirror, which can be tough, especially for him.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with the trial of Derek Chauvin. In the courtroom, it was all about the guilt or innocence of this one former Minneapolis police officer accused of the murder of George Floyd. But outside the courtroom, in Minneapolis, really across the country and around the world, there's a much greater significance in the search for racial and social justice. It is a quest, Rhonda, that has often been denied or delayed, and for decades, Rhonda.
That's right, Brian. From the fictional story of To Kill a Mockingbird to the real-life drama of some of the country's darkest moments in the civil rights movement, forgotten by many, but immortalized by Hollywood.
Oh, I love her hair. I heard she don't put rollers in it. It's just like that. But I studied. I know how she do it. See, she parts in the middle, and then...
It took decades for full justice for the Ku Klux Klan members who planted the bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And the final prosecution came only after the then U.S. Attorney and future U.S. Senator Doug Jones pushed for action.
When he was a U.S. attorney in the early 2000s, Jones brought 2 white supremacists to justice decades after a deadly attack. It was for their involvement in the 1963 Birmingham church bombing.
4 young black girls, aged 11 to 14, were killed when a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. More than 10 years later, in 1977, a white supremacist named Robert Chomless was convicted of murder for participating in the bombing. Then in the year 2000, the FBI announced that 3 other men were also involved. One of them was already dead, but the other 2 were tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison.
And we're joined now by former prosecutor Doug Jones and former U.S. Senator Doug, thanks so much for joining us. You made history with the prosecution in Alabama. How do you think the trial of Derek Chauvin will be regarded by historians in future years in terms of the ability to find social and racial justice in this country?
Well, you know, Brian, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you guys today. I am hoping that this is going to go down in the annals of history as a significant event. Because if Derek Chauvin is convicted, it will be in large measure because of the breakdown in what they've called the blue wall of silence. It is very difficult. I can tell you, as both a prosecutor, as a defense lawyer, it's difficult to convict a police officer, law enforcement officer, of a criminal act even when there is a death occurred. And so what we've seen in this case, I believe, is not just the outcry and the cries for social justice that was prompted by the death of George Floyd. But what we've seen in this trial in particular was a very methodical way that the prosecution laid out a case, and they used police officers, his fellow police officers on that Minneapolis police force, to make the case that what he did was outside not just the norm, but outside the bounds of the law. So that's where I believe this case is really going to have some significance for law enforcement and for justice. As the prosecutor said today, this is actually not an anti-law enforcement case. This is a pro-law enforcement case, and I completely agree with that.
Exactly. It was the closing argument there. This is a pro-police case. Why is that appeal necessary for jurors, do you think? Because there's such a trust and belief in the assignment of police officers and their responsibilities?
It's not just a trust and belief. It is you want to believe. You want to put your faith in there. After all, these law enforcement officers are there for you as well. They're there for those members of the community that are sitting in that jury box, that are sitting in judgment of the police officer. So that, I don't like to use the word given the benefit of the doubt, but they do to some extent. They want to make sure that they get this right. And so it is that trust, it is that enforcement, it is that knowing that they've got to do the right things to allow the law enforcement the leeway to protect the community and use the force necessary. But when they cross that line, they need to hold them accountable.
Doug, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
In the history of the civil rights movement, where would you put the Derek Chauvin trial and this moment in time where we've seen so much unrest in the streets again? Where does it fit into the timeline? Is it a big step forward? Where are we at now?
Yeah, Rhonda, it's a great question because I think it's a huge step forward. What happened with George Floyd really changed some dynamics around here. The pandemic really put a spotlight on the racial disparities that we've known existed in this country. We've known for a long time in healthcare and jobs and the economy. And we've known they've existed in law enforcement. But when in the middle of this pandemic, people at home, people sequestered in their homes, they saw the death of this black man with a police officer's knee on his neck the way it was. All of a sudden, people just rose up in anger. And a lot of people woke up and said, we understand now. Those of us who've been preaching this for a long time, got it, we've known about it, but there's a lot of folks in this country who just didn't see it that way until they saw those images. Since that time, we've kind of pulled back a little bit. We've seen some violence that kind of took away the message. I really hope that this case will once again reignite the idea that we need to have some significant law enforcement reform and reignite the debate that we've got about race in this country, not just in law enforcement, but across the spectrum of American life.
Doug, what specific reforms do you think are required or necessary for policing in this country?
Well, there's a couple of things, Brian, and I was a co-sponsor when I was in the Senate of the George Floyd Police Reform Act. It's passed the House of Representatives twice now. It died in the Senate. It never got a vote in the Senate. There's any number of things that I believe that can happen. Let's talk about transparency. There needs to be more transparency in these excessive force reviews and investigations. I like to have citizens. In Birmingham, just today, the mayor of Birmingham, Randall Woodfin, announced a review commission to look at these and have citizens and former police officers on there as well. I think that transparency is very important. I think having a registry of some type that these law enforcement excessive force allegations that are made can travel with these folks. Sometimes they just get buried and people can move around and no one knows that they've had any number of complaints against them. I think more funding needs to be made and had at the federal and local level for training, particularly both racial sensitivity training as well as de-escalation training. That's what caused so many of the problems last year, is that between police officers and those out in the streets, that no one tried to de-escalate this, and we've got to do that. And finally, I think we've got to look at the obvious things, the no-knock warrants, the chokeholds. Those need to be taken away from law enforcement. They're not necessary. And finally, we're going to look at whether or not qualified immunity needs to be stricken. The judges are looking at that. I think Congress and the state laws have to take a look at qualified immunity. I don't know if it needs to be completely gotten rid of, but it sure needs to be tweaked such that we can balance out the needs of law enforcement, but allow communities, allow families to have that redress that they deserve in the court system.
And finally, from the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing to the Derek Chauvin trial, Do you see progress, real progress, being made in terms of the search for social and racial justice?
Brian, I think that's the $64,000 question right now. Have we seen that? Yes, we have seen it, but we have also seen some serious backsliding in the last few years. It stems in everywhere from voting rights to law enforcement. I think what we have seen in the last 4 years, in particularly, we've seen a lot of public officials, including the former president of the United States, using what we in the South call dog whistle kind of rhetoric. It kind of gives a green light and a rise of white supremacy that is taking over. People need to stand up a little more. They need to do exactly what John Lewis everyone needs to channel their inner John Lewis and stand up, speak out, and cause a little good trouble, because we have got to move this country in a way that everyone is equal, everyone is treated equally and fairly in both business, society, and especially our system of justice.
All right. Former U.S. Senator, former federal prosecutor Doug Jones, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Up next, COVID-19 vaccine, the phobia and the mania. We'll talk with former Acting Surgeon General Dr. Boris Lushniak. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. As of this week, every adult in America is eligible to receive a COVID-19 vaccine. And according to the CDC, at least half of adult Americans have already received at least one dose. But behind that good news are some troubling questions about vaccine safety and vaccine phobia. So to get some answers to that, we're joined by our good friend, Dr. Boris Lushniak, who's the Dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland and the former Acting Surgeon General. Dr. Lushniak, thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks for having me on again, Brian. Great to see you.
With questions now about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and distribution held up, that is not good for public confidence, is it?
You know, it's one of those situations where there's good news and there's bad news out of this. One thing is, most importantly, is that we have to monitor the adverse events that are reported with each of the vaccines that are out there. Don't forget that these are brand new vaccines, and this is a brand new campaign of trying to immunize all of the United States, at some point all of the world, right, with brand new vaccines. So we have to take this sense of any reported adverse events quite seriously. So the bad news is we found something that is of concern, right? The good news is something's being done about it. So we put a hold on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There's going to be a reanalysis of what's really going on. And hopefully in the next few days, we'll either get a thumbs up to move ahead or we'll get further information to either ease our minds or to tell us to be a little bit more vigilant in the midst of all this. As a public health person, this is the right approach at this stage of a vaccine campaign.
Yet it has given ammunition to the anti-vaxxers and the feeding of a vaccine phobia. We had a program last week with evangelical Christians. About 40% don't want to take the vaccine. As a public health expert, how do you counter that? How do you deal with that?
Well, again, you have to come up with the facts. This is data-driven information. And so I ask anybody who's a skeptic over the vaccine, look at the facts. Two things are really critical with the release of a vaccine, such as the vaccines that we have against COVID-19. One is, are they working? And the reality is they are working. Look at the information that's out there. It has really decreased the number of hospitalizations for people who are vaccinated. It has decreased the number of people who die from COVID who have been vaccinated. And in fact, even these breakthrough COVID-19 scenarios are very small in number. So it protects us from the disease overall. In terms of the safety effects, once again, you have to look at this realistically, right? 7 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine were given, and right now we're reacting to 6 people. Yes, this is a serious adverse event. 1 person died. 1 person is in serious condition. This is important that we not neglect this, that we not ignore this, but we move ahead, get the right information, and then at the end of the day, I want to be able to prove through data that the vaccines work and, in fact, they are safe.
Dr. Lushniak, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
So where does the future how does it look to you? Are we all going to be able to get together by Memorial Day, or is it going to be Labor Day? What do you see ahead in the next few months?
You know, it all depends on how things go regarding the vaccines. A lot of unknowns are still out there. So first of all, as I mentioned already, vaccines are working and they are safe. So we have an incredible campaign, as Brian had stated. Over half of Americans have received one dose. This is an incredible public health achievement for the good of our country. At the same time, the virus keeps changing, right? And so we have to be able to monitor these variants of the virus. We have to be able to see whether that virus changes enough for us to be concerned. I'm an optimist, Rhonda, when it comes to this. I'm really looking forward to the middle of summer really being a game changer for the way we are dealing with this pandemic. It's not going to be an all clear necessarily, but it's going to be a changed environment if we do things correctly.
And doctor, to follow up on that, there's something called the Vaccine Mania with so many people now vaccinated. They want to take their masks off. In Israel, in fact, they're no longer requiring masks outside. Do we really need to wear a mask outdoors if we've been vaccinated?
Well, for now, I'm really sort of touting the CDC recommendations on this, right? So to the listeners, to the audience out there, look at what CDC is saying. In general, right now, we're still advising the use of masks, hand washing, being careful with large crowd situations, the idea of physical distancing. Why? Because I'm a little afraid that if people feel that they are fully protected from the COVID-19 because they've been vaccinated, that this may lead to setbacks rather than taking a very conservative approach. Right? The vaccine takes a while to kick in. At the same time, we still have to prove that we are no longer infectious, even though we ourselves have been vaccinated. A lot of unknowns are out there. I'm just asking everybody to be a little bit more vigilant, a little bit more careful, and give it a little bit more time before we call an all clear regarding this pandemic. It's going to happen, but we have to do it right.
All right. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Boris Lushniak, the Dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland.
Great. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined, as always, by Aidan McLaughlin, who is the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law&Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams Media Company. And Aidan, we begin with your winner, John Berman, the co-host of the CNN morning program, for his sharp commentary. Here's some of that.
Look, Maxine Waters needs to answer to Maxine Waters. She has said incendiary things in the past, and this is a week where the nation is very much on edge. But Ted Cruz needs to look in the mirror, which can be tough, especially for him. Because you know what they say, when the going gets tough, the pot goes to Cancun.
So, Aidan, why John Berman? He's a great writer. When I worked with him at ABC, he started as just a writer on the World News, worked his way up to correspondent, and left to CNN, where he's now an anchor.
Yeah, so he's an anchor at New Day, which is CNN's breakfast show, which is supposed to compete with Morning Joe on MSNBC and Fox and Friends over on Fox News. He also has a new co-host of New Day, Breonna Keeler, who was a anchor in the afternoon, who has now replaced Allison Camerata, who was his former co-host for a couple of years. Camerata has now moved to the afternoons. Breonna Keeler, who made a name for herself on CNN for sort of fiery opinion segments, has now moved to join John Berman in the mornings for New Day. Today was Breonna Keeler's first day co-hosting New Day with John Berman. But we really thought that John Berman stole the show today with this segment, which was calling out Ted Cruz's hypocrisy on violent rhetoric. Ted Cruz took issue with Maxine Waters' comments about protesters in Minneapolis. Berman was pointing out that Ted Cruz enabled Donald Trump up until the January 6th riot, when Trump's own violent rhetoric caused the ransacking of the Capitol. So it was a smart segment, and it's a good sort of revamp that New Day's having today. And John Berman kicked it off to a good start, we thought.
And there's a mix then of news analysis and some opinion.
Yeah, you know, New Day has always been a newsier morning show than Morning Joe on MSNBC, which is obviously liberal, and Fox and Friends on Fox News, which is a little bit more conservative. So it's always been a bit more of a news program, sort of in CNN's vein of cable news. But it's gotten a little bit more opinionated, I think, over the years. It used to have Chris Cuomo co-hosting with Allison Camerata. Now it has Breonna Keeler, who's one of CNN's more opinionated hosts.
So edgy seems to work. Let's go to your loser, something called OAN. Tell our viewers what that is and why they are losers.
That's right. So OAN is a pro-Trump news network that's run by Robert and Charles Herring, a father and son duo. And it's sort of similar to Newsmax, which is another alternative to Fox News that embraced Donald Trump's fantasy that he actually won the 2020 election until it was stolen from him. OAN is actually a little bit fringier than Newsmax, even, I would say. It's considerably more conspiratorial. And the New York Times did a lengthy expose on the network this weekend, which interviewed a bunch of current and former employees of OAN. More than a dozen of them resigned from the network after the January 6th riot because they saw that programming as having fueled that. And you even had current employees of OAN who were going on the record with the New York Times saying that they thought that it was a conspiratorial network that contributed to that riot. One of those staffers was fired today. Overall, it's a pretty bad week for a network that never is particularly done very well in the headline.
And its owner, Mr. Herring, at the center of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's pretty much why we made him loser. He defended the network in comments to the New York Times. I don't think he's really convincing anyone that it is a serious news network or that it has any sort of rigorous news deliverance.
Okay. Aidan McLaughlin, once again, editor-in-chief of Mediaite, thank you so much for this week's winners and losers. And thanks to all of you for watching tonight. We'll see you again next week. And thanks to our great staff at Law&Crime for getting us on and off the air.